welcome to folks joining via the recording. And my apologies to folks who do join by the recording for not being up to date with the with uploading to YouTube. I will make sure that is done. So today we have 3 topics that we're going to talk through: modeling, and then either a very big or very short topic about APIs from the API perspective, which is about URIs. So the modeling topics, we have a reasonably old issue raised by Semi about different attributions and uncertainty around them, which is issue 229, and then a very new issue which came up here, that with our new emphasis on or new pattern around meta types having a classification on a classification, the brief text pattern stands out a little bit as a sore thumb, where the brief text classification is on the statement rather than on the type of statement. So we might want to reconsider that for consistency, and it would be good to do that sooner rather than later, because it seems like quite a significant and important change to make. It will affect a lot of data. So let me share my screen so that video folks have something to look at. Hopefully that's showing up. So the first issue is 229. So Semi, I guess it was your issue back in May. Apologies for throwing you in the deep end without much warning. Would you like?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Luckily, I'm very verbose in my GitHub issues apparently, so I'm quickly reminded of my thoughts here. And I also reference our specific repos issue as well. But essentially, I have a feeling this might end up being kind of 2 things. Is another one of our kind of asking everybody to provide examples of these types of ambiguities or qualifiers that they use in their catalog. So I've provided my list here. But my main question is, how can I, when my institution links in our, our collection management system, EMU, we put a link to the party record, say for example, Titian, when really it's a workshop of Titian, and we have a separate field that's in the same table that qualifies that link to Titian's record. But then we also have a record, a party record or actor record, if I want to use the right terms that we use here, for the workshop of Titian's. They're kind of used inconsistently, which is more of a data thing, but I believe we'd probably have just one model that could handle those, and then we'd work out the data side on our end, what our source data is. But instead of saying this object was created by, this production event carried out by this person, I do want to somehow link to Titian, but qualify that it's actually just the workshop of. And also if there's any just controlled vocabularies for those kinds of entities, instead of linking directly to Titian, then that would be something that I would be interested in knowing of too, like if Getty has workshop of Titian.
Great, thank you. So this has also recently come up here, the attribution modifier pattern, and yeah, it seemed worth discussing, even if it's not necessarily exactly about provenance, but we ran out our provenance topics last week, which is lovely. So I picked this one out of the backlog to work on. So yes, it seems like we can do attribute assignments for some of these things, and classify them with the possibly, probably, or formally. So to cut these ones out first, attributed to, we could have an attribute assignment which assigns either a person to a production or a part to a production, without necessarily any classification here. That's just what attribute assignment does. So ignoring the possibly, what we have started sort of looking at is this pattern, not of assigning who carried out, so you could say the attribute assignment was that the production was carried out by a person. However, what we found was there's quite a lot of times when we wanted to say it was carried out, it was believed to be carried out by someone at some time, at which point you need some intermediate node to capture both the time span and the person, or it was carried out by Rembrandt in Amsterdam, at which point you would need to have the took place at property as well as the person. So then if you wanted to have it was possibly carried out by Rembrandt in 1700 and it was possibly carried out by Van Gogh in 1800, and I know this is a terrible example and the dates are all wrong, etc., but you get the point. Then you wouldn't want to have lots of attribute assignments, because then you couldn't say Rembrandt 1700 and Van Gogh 1800. Instead, you would have possibly Rembrandt, possibly 1700, possibly Van Gogh, possibly 1800, without the two sort of bits of data being connected together. So in order to avoid that problem, we have looked at, so this is the production of the top one, sorry, is the production of the object, which must occur because it was definitely produced by someone at some point. The attribute assignment then assigns a part of that production, which was carried out by the person and took place at a place and happened at a certain time span, used a particular technique, all of our favorite properties for productions. So modeling wise, assigned and assigned to have been in CRM for a while. They're sort of P140 and P141. Assigned property is relatively new. It's, I forget the exact number, 177. I think this was the number that got reused, everyone complained about, but so it'll be. Which points to a property, and hence we sort of have the triple of this production has part, this production, but it's not, this dotted line is indirect. It's only, it doesn't exist in the data directly, it's only via this attribute assignment pointing to the part property. So that was how we thought to do the sort of the basic attribution, where we want to say something about the attribution. Any what questions or comments do you have at this stage?
In photos, this is huge, and we/I did it differently.
How did you do it?
So they have, I mean, there's lots and lots of data around historical understanding of who might have been involved in the production of something, or something more general like this workshop school sort of question. So it's important to get that represented, and represented in the most efficient way possible. Because we So yes, essentially because we don't have the 0.1 embargo and we use the instantiated class or instantiated class for the relation of carried out by, then you can have so you always represent the role of the creator. So there you can, so you can just create regular CRM statements which are such and such was involved in the production in such and such a role. And that's the neutral statement without attribution, and in the normal course of things, it means that the people who created this database believe this to be true. But when you're doing the art historical analysis, then you're also recording that from time A to time B, it was believed that this was the school of such and such, or it was attributed to so-and-so, but later on it got reattributed to somebody else. So the so it's also an attribute assignment strategy, and so it's to assign the .1 node to the production. And then for the workshop thing, that's where it made a nice symmetric pattern, is we just made an extension off of 15, P15, which is motivated by, to say the manner of motivation. And there you can put in things like after and in the school of and these sorts of things. So you can model these kinds of things that Sammy was saying are typically documented, where you would say, you find this information, says, well, it's in the after Titian. And so you want to make a direct connection to some such artist and also give the mode of relation that's being stipulated. And that has the advantage that you can link all of these different opinions onto the same production node, but keep the usual pattern of carried out by and extend it with this motivated by.
Yep. And it uses the sort of PC 14.
The PC thing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, which we have not used to date. Of course, it doesn't mean that we can't. So, given that you bring up the consistency with style of, etc., let me quickly throw up what we did for style of. Sorry, I should have done this before the meeting, but such as busy life. So we ran into exactly the same question of how to do style of when the person isn't the one who actually carried out the production. So style of Rembrandt might have been long dead by the time the production was actually carried out. The same with follower of, or school of, if not pupil of. So in order to avoid to try to solve, in inverted commas, the .1 problem, where we want to say it was influenced by or motivated by some person in the role of their style, we then created a new property in the linked art space, Getty space at the moment, but okay. Property classified as, which is essentially, here is a qualifier, or it could be qualified as, changing the name is easy, to say what sort of qualifier is there on this influence. Well, it was the style of. So this diagram would be the production of the object was influenced by Rembrandt, possibly influenced by Rembrandt, and that sort of influence was style of. So then by adding this guy, we solve all of the .1 properties if we're using an attribute assignment. It's consistent with this pattern, which doesn't use any dot ones, but it also doesn't use the PC reification classes. And it doesn't introduce one class per relationship, which is the complication with PC, that there is a PC14 for describing P14s carried out wise. Carried out by whatever 14 is, and one for every single other property that has a dot one. So in the set of use cases that we've encountered, at least, this gets through all of them. So to go back up here, follow school of, let's ignore workshop of for now, but school of, follower of, circle of, when they're not an actual, certainly follower of and school of. Given that they're not actual groups, they're just schools of thought, I guess. Then there is an influence by the master who has the school in inverted commas. And then what sort of influence was it? Well, it was the school of, or the style of, manner of, follower of, etc., etc. of. So then, yeah, George, thoughts on this?
I just think that I mean, we definitely went down the same problem path and came up with similar solutions. The reason why it was interesting to favor the other one, I mean, what I find what's uncomfortable about using the attribute assignment where you have to intervene between the property is that by creating this dot one off of 15, you create a consistent query pattern where you can ignore the attribute assignment and just query the basic relationship you would think to be looking for. So you say, I'm interested in the actor and what their role was in the relationship, or I'm interested in the production, or I'm interested in the motivating actors and what form of motivation it was. And you ignore who said what, and you just return those results. But then you can go searching more for who said what. Whereas if you, in order to grab this data, then you have to do this extra pattern in order to get, like as a user, I think you'd want to get back also the people that are regularly attributed with the normal pattern, but also all the people that were believed in the past. And in order to get that, you have to create substantially different query patterns, whereas with the other strategy, you just know where to look for it. And then if you find multiple opinions, then you say, why is it both created by so-and-so and so-and-so? And then you can follow the path down to the attributions and what grounds them.
I'm not sure I entirely follow, because isn't well, look at this one, I guess. So in your pattern that motivated by or influenced by would be instantiated in the data, this would be a real link, which I guess we could do here as well, but there's no reason to not put it in, I guess. But you still have the PC node over here where we have the attribute assignment.
I mean, you're influenced by is simply materialized. That's the main, and the assigned to is assigning to the, you assign to the production the node of influencing. And
I see. Yeah. So the node of influencing is where person is.
Yes, in terms of.
Yeah.
Rob,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was wondering how all of this comports or fits with ULON records, because there are records for followers of, workshop of, those kind of things there. And would it be easy to map between them?
Oops, it's not style of, it's not mineral either.
Don't you need to change the ULAN?
There's a bunch, that's a terrible search. There's a bunch of attribution modifiers, which is what I was searching for. So here is some of them, possibly, probably formally and attributed to.
Yeah.
So these guys would live, if I go back, this is here. This is exactly these ones. Okay. And it might not be, they might not be live yet.
Well, I'm
anyway,
I'm also thinking of, there are ULAN records where the record is workshop of Peter Vischer.
Yeah. So workshops, yeah, or ateliers.
Can be substantial things, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
can be real things, exactly. So instead of, if you know, yeah, so for workshop of, that could just be a group. So if you want to say workshop of so-and-so, you could have the production being carried out by a group. The group is the workshop. You would still want to link it to the person if you don't want to use ULAN directly. You know, say it's workshop of Rembrandt, and there isn't a workshop of Rembrandt in ULAN, or you just want to link it to Rembrandt directly, then the formation of the group is influenced by Rembrandt, is how we have modeled that particular link. Okay.
So those things are fully modeled in ULAN. Okay. All right.
But it's an interesting issue. It's like there's a good nuance in there, and there's like a question of like not overly modeling the data, because we're modeling like an epistemological state at this point. Like somebody thought that it was this, or somebody said this, and so if they say school of, then depending on what you know about what they said, you might not want to over model it and create or use the school of you or I if they really had a school, because you don't know exactly what is the intention of the person who's making the attribution.
Yep. Looking at the time, I suggest that this might be better thrashed out with a whiteboard in Philadelphia, but at least we've opened the door and gotten some stuff on the table. George, if you could throw up some equivalent diagrams for comparison,
will do. Yeah, sure.
Would be great.
Yep.
And we can also do the same for the other copy of and workshop of, I think, are the other two ones that will almost certainly be slightly different for both of our very slightly different models. So we can do them as well.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So then,
Rob, can I add a quick point about this?
Yep.
I think maybe we are talking about two different things, in that I think maybe the possibly and probably could apply to anything, not only the attributions.
Yes.
So maybe we need to, when discussing this issue again in Philadelphia, maybe we need to sort of bear in mind that there's probably a different pattern to deal with the possibility and probability.
Yeah, yeah, that was one reason why we quite liked this as well. That for example, in provenance, we have two different equally reliable sources for the price that was. The hammer price of an auction, and they're clearly not just the same thing in different currencies or whatever. So you know, one source says it was 100 and one source says it was 1,000. You know, we don't want to, they're both reputable, we can't really decide. So we wanted to say it was possibly 100 and possibly 1,000 and not make any particular assertion, which would mean that this pattern would be exactly the same for that case, that it would be the payment possibly had a monetary amount of 100 or possibly a monetary amount of 1,000, and we can't pick one. So yeah, that was one thing that we liked about this particular pattern, but indeed we should keep that. The scope is not just person, or it's not just talking about the production of the object. Yeah, a very good point. Right, so briefly, if you'll excuse the pun, we currently have throughout the documentation, which I shall bring up, statements where the object is referred to by a bit of text, in this case a material statement, and it is a brief text, which then has some content down here. So note, please, that there is one classified as, one P2 has typed, which this linguistic object is a material statement and it's a brief text. However, as of Oxford, we have a bunch of meta properties where, if we go look at example, up here in base. So here's the object, it's classified as a painting, and the paintingness is classified as type of work. So this seems within our base patterns to have two very similar and not identical patterns. One where we classify the paintingness as being a type of work, and one where we would say that this it doesn't quite match, but for brief text we have the thing at this level having two types rather than a cascade. So the proposal is that brief text should be the meta type of the statement. So what sort of thing is this? Well, it's a statement, it's a brief text. That would then be consistent with all of the other meta type patterns and reduce the number of lists of things that you need to sort of sort through. It also means that if you have a new type of statement, then you have the advantage of being able to classify it as being a statement, so that processors can trigger off of brief text in the same way that they would trigger off of type of work to say that this, what was one of Ethan's examples? Denarius is a type of work. Even if you don't recognize what denarius actually is, you can process it in exactly the same way as all other types of work. However, this is a big change given that we've had this sort of baseline pattern of statements for quite a long time now. But if there's any time to change it, it would be as soon as we recognize it. So, any thoughts on this one in terms of, I guess, two issues to weigh up? One, the consistency. Is it better to have the consistency of the classified as the same way as type of work, and the extent of the change? From the documentation side, it's easy because all of the examples are generated automatically. But for people who have data already, what sort of challenges might this introduce. What are your thoughts?
Can I ask just a clarification question?
Yep.
So just for understanding, so the proposal is that now we have all these nice new URIs that give things like material statements and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We keep that, we're happy with that, and then the idea is to make this brief text thing the meta type for all of those.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Then I don't have data, so I can't speak to that. The one question I would have is, would brief text be the right thing then, or would it be, because you have that problem with like, well, what is a brief text? It's not being brief. So just about a term, like if it would be more like text or description, just something to think about. But as far as consistency, that sounds nice.
Yeah, yeah, we can change what URI if brief text isn't a good meta type, we can find a better meta type for sure. That would be easy. We asked Patricia to add brief text. We can ask her to add a subtly different one as well, or change brief text to be more meta-y.
Well, then the question is, does it destroy people's data?
Or is it just, is the consistency a crutch for weak minds, or whatever the saying goes? Is this a valuable change? It seems like it is, but
you would think that it would make developers happy.
That's, yeah, and it was developers that brought it up. So
I don't hear any complaints.
Yep. Okay. Right. Let's do it. And yeah, if people run into issues, please do bring them back. Nothing is set in stone until it is. We can always revert.
Given that we're a bit low on the call today, and I'm thinking, I don't think Dave is here, are people who have data, is it worth flagging this one on the list as a change that has happened and yell if it's terrible?
Terrible. Yep. Yep. Agreed. I'll do that. Okay. So thank you for thinking about that, folks. And yeah, if anything comes to mind, do respond on the list. We should talk about URIs at least to the point where we are, where we have an understanding of the complexity of the question. So in a lot of API development, the URI is not treated as a completely opaque string that just has references to it. It has some internal structure. So, for example, in IIIF, in the image API, you can manipulate parts of the URI to get the image server to give you different portions of the image, or the image in different sizes, or with different rotations, or in different color schemes, and so on. Conversely, in IIIF's presentation API, we, in the major version 2, we sort of had some recommended URI patterns, and in 3, which is not quite out yet, but just around the corner, the consensus was that they were more harmful than good, because it implied that there was some processing that you could do with them, rather than simply having to follow your nose and figure out by dereferencing the JSON LD, this is a manifest, or this is a annotation, or this is a collection, and so on. So for the Linked Art API, we're sort of in the same position, where it's we could specify either recommendations or requirements around the URI construction for the objects, or we could be completely silent and you just have to follow your nose to get from the production of the object to the person, and until you get there, you can't just tell a priori that it's a person rather than a group from the URI. So there's, I think, yeah, a few options that we could go down. What we have been doing here is to separate out different API or different URI constructs for the class. So physical things go into an object or a physical thing, that appears in the URI. Person appears in the URI for people. Group appears in the URI for groups. Text appears in the URI for textual linguistic objects, and so on. That makes it slightly easier from the implementation side because you just dump all of the physical things into a directory together. But yes, there's no real reason to do that. It doesn't actually mean anything to the machine. It's only useful for humans. Talking with Dave Odette about this, who couldn't be on the call, I think the NGA's current view is it would be better just to be silent, and then you can divide them up as you choose, or you can put them all into one big bucket with a bunch of UUIDs, and the system that is processing that bucket will know how to deal with the identifiers in it. So any thoughts or opinions? Well, what are your opinions? I'm sure people have them on URI construction. Should we make some recommendations, or should we have some real requirements, or should we just be silent about them?
So I think that from the consumer part, it doesn't really matter. So it might help with readability to actually have some patterns in place. But I know that for us, for example, this is something we're now designing and we're quite struggling with, and we would like to have some best practices, for example, to see how we could approach this. And I think especially for blank notes, where do we start using those and where do we use sensible URIs? Having some patterns there would also be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so a vote for recommendations rather than requirements or silence?
Yes.
Yep.
I'd agree with recommendations over requirements. I guess the challenge with these kinds of patterns is always that a good pattern, a good example is actually really helpful to a developer when they're trying to work out what's going on, possibly so helpful that they start doing things the wrong way and not following the data. But equally, not giving any guidance can lead to some bad examples out there. And I think it's just human nature that people will always look for something and copy it and adapt it. So I think there's a lot of positive in having not necessarily, not something that is anything close to a must, but at least a good example of something that everyone agrees is a good example for people to be able to copy or adapt.
Yep. So something like having examples with object in the URI, but not you must use OBJECT in the slot in the URI.
Right.
Yep.
And I think that also, although I'd be interested to hear what people think, in the past, what I found is that can also come down to what is the backing in the system. So actually it's counterintuitive for people to use the word, say, object, if what they call that thing locally is not object, if you see what I mean. Right?
Yep.
And I know that's something that obviously the API is straightening out, but I think sometimes this is where sort of colloquialisms and local practice come in. So I think it's very much more about saying, here is an example of good practice that's well documented. I think that's definitely very helpful. But anything further than that is hard to see how we get it right for everyone.
Yep.
And another point maybe worth making is that if URIs have patterns that include some sort of semantics there, in a future sort of processing of the data set, this assignment of the semantics may no longer be valid. So if you change your mind and something is no longer an object, so that would mean that in the next iteration of whatever you publish these URIs, you're going to break the consistency over a period of time. So perhaps that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's sort of an eternal conversation. But I agree with Thanasis, that's the one side of the coin. And then the other side of the coin is that the humans are important in this circle, and they're supposed to be the ones that use it, hopefully at some point. So having somehow comprehensible URIs is also very functional for humans. So I don't know if it's crossed it. In my opinion would be, I don't know if it's it's the thing that linked art needs to bear, but not only does it provide some readability for humans, but it can also give some indications on how to use the ontology correctly, in terms of like something like giving some indications on how you might correctly formulate a production event URI. Also helps it maybe with an understanding of the ontology, because it's like you should have one production URI for your thing because it's only made once. These sorts of questions. But I think it is a big task, and there's a lot of contradictory opinions.
Yep.
I mean, personally, I sometimes like to think of it as I think it's okay. In fact, I think it's good because there are humans involved in developing the tools to have hints in the URIs. I'm always a bit nervous if we start thinking of those as computationally processable semantics.
Yep.
And I think it's that distinction that's pretty critical.
No, that's a good point.
Yep.
But of course, humans being what they are, would love to not distinguish between those two, despite best laid plans. That's unsolvable. So we live with that.
Yep. And we do have the partitioning of the API, partitioning the graph into chunks. So one thing that we could do would be simply to say each partition should have its own mnemonic, and here are some possible mnemonics if you want to use them, but there is no requirement that they do, and if they do, then they shouldn't be treated any differently by machines, because they might not have them. Great. Well, it is the top of the hour. Thank you very much, everyone. So our next call will not be in 2 weeks' time, given that I think that would be New Year's Day, if my math is correct. So it will be January 15th. We'll have the sort of final details for the Philadelphia face-to-face meeting. We should talk about levels of implementation, which that topic is, can we distinguish features of that every implementation really must do for it to be useful, and other features that are optional but still valuable. And then modeling, I guess before then we can go through the issue list and try to pick out some that will be useful precursor to the Philadelphia meeting on the 28th. Great. So thank you to John for taking the notes. They look fantastic. Everyone have a happy holidays, a safe and warm New Year. And we'll meet again in 4 weeks' time.
Well, good. Happy New Year.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy New Year.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.